Hey there. Thank you for joining me. We're going to have some Friday fun. Nothing crazy. We're going to kind of go through a few things I've talked about before, but at the end of the video, I'm going to get into why I'm sharing this Friday fun this week. So uh, stay tuned for that. But I've shared before how I love football, and especially the Chicago Bears. And I just recently shared how I love listening to podcasts. And there's one NFL podcast that I listen to. Um, and I found this podcast very early when I was first looking up podcasts, found them, um, really, really enjoyed it. And it's hard for me to find an NFL news outlet that I like because so much news about football right now focuses almost exclusively on fantasy football. And I couldn't care less about fantasy football. Um, I've never really gotten into fantasy football. It's just not something that I find particularly enjoyable. A lot of people love it, and hats off to you guys. But when I'm engaging with football, I'm like, I want to know who wins and loses. I'm going to follow my team. I'm not following different players, trying to pick players to get fantasy points that don't connect to how games go necessarily. So yeah, I'm not a big fantasy football person. Didn't want fantasy football news, and I swear 99% of the football podcasts that you will find on uh, NFL football are focused on fantasy football, and I was just like, I'm not doing it. Um, but I found a podcast called Around the NFL, and man, it's so good. These guys, there are four guys who host it, and then they have an editor and producer who she inserts herself into it, and I'm sure that uh, they always enjoy her having her there and getting her takes and her opinions, especially when it comes around to things that she would be especially passionate about. But uh, producer Erica Tamposi, the hosts are Dan Hansis, Mark Sessler, Greg Rosenthal, and Chris Wessling. Um, awesome podcast. It's so much fun. They look at the news that's going on. They look at they'll break down the games after they've been played. Um, they will try to inject fun into their podcast, which sports can get so boring when that doesn't happen. But they inject their personality and they have fun with it. They uh, have a lot of jokes that are just kind of running bits on the podcast, but they also, I mean, they just have fun doing it. You can tell how much they enjoy it. They enjoy their different teams and their kind of different takes on the NFL and sports and how things are going. So I love it. There's going to be a link to get you to the web page for Around the NFL. You can look them up on iTunes or Spotify. You can also, I'll put a link to their latest podcast that's on YouTube. Um, but I do have a bone to pick with them because I have no idea why, but they are the worst at covering the Chicago Bears. And I'm sure there are other franchises that feel like they don't get covered appropriately, but this podcast is the worst at covering the Bears. I mean, my goodness, they one of their bits is that every year they pick a team of ATL, a team of Around the League, which is the old podcast name before they got brought into the NFL brand. Um, but they pick a team of ATL, and they picked the Bears 2 years ago. And I swear most weeks came and went, and they didn't even make reference to the Bears as the team of ATL. And the Bears were having an awesome season, and things were going so well for the Bears. Trubisky was doing better than anyone expected him to be doing. The Bears defense was destructive. I mean, they were destroying teams with their defense. They were so much fun to watch. And the podcast, most weeks, even though they are supposed to, when they pick this team, they will like make this big deal of this team. And the year before, they made a big deal of having the Los Angeles Rams as the team of ATL. And every week it was, oh man, like here's the team of ATL, and they have their theme song and breaking things down. And man, they would talk about the Bears, and I think most weeks they didn't even mention that the Bears were the team of ATL. It was so frustrating. And then I know that this is a not super popular opinion about how football's played, but my dad was super into defense and hard hitting football, and um, I'm all for the player safety measures that they're making, even though it's taking some of these harder hits out of the game. But you got to protect your players. They are the best asset the NFL has. But it seems like fewer and fewer people respect and enjoy defensive football. And uh, the way that the Bears are often talked about, like they are a team that will dominate you defensively, and if they get a so-so offensive performance, they can win a good number of their games because their defense is so good. But that often doesn't get recognized. It doesn't get recognized that, man, if the Bears got an average starter, they would probably be one of the better teams in professional football. But the Bears haven't just gotten that kind of average, middle of the road starter. They've gotten quarterbacks who might have a good upside, but man, when they have a bad game, then it is ugly. Um, they had Rex Grossman. Kyle Orton came in and started to kind of show that he could be that quarterback who would just control things for the Bears. Well, then they went and got Jay Cutler, and when Jay Cutler was doing all right, then yeah, things were good. But you also had those bad Jay Cutler performances where he would cost them games. Now we have Mitch Trubisky. It's the same way. If he has a good game, then it looks good. But if he has a bad game, it's really not good for the Bears. But the big thing that made me think about this is Patrick Mahomes has been in the news a lot this year. Um, I mean, he led the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl and another MVP year for him. Just an incredible quarterback. And he was even injured a couple weeks. Still probably the most valuable player of the league. I think he won the Super Bowl MVP as well. I mean, just incredible guy. Incredible player. Picked after the Bears picked Mitch Trubisky. And just this week, he signed a deal, 10 years, $450 million. Basically, the Chiefs saying, we want to pay you enough that you will never think of leaving because you are that important to us succeeding. And good for him, good for the Chiefs. They struck gold on Patrick Mahomes and they developed him properly. Awesome. In the Bears' defense, I don't remember hearing anyone talk about Patrick Mahomes being this good coming out of college. I remember people when Mahomes was being held back and then the Chiefs got rid of Alex Smith and they're like, yeah, Mahomes is our guy. People were like, well, they've been developing him in the background, and there were questions about whether he was that next step, whether he was going to be that good, or if this was just a huge gamble that wouldn't pay off. And it's kind of revisionist history for us to look back on it and be like, man, the Bears so missed out on Patrick Mahomes. I mean, I don't remember anyone talking about Patrick Mahomes. But the Bears made a huge mistake in that draft. Because I remember number one, everyone knew who was coming off at number one. And then there was the second pick. No one was quite sure what was going to happen with that pick. And the Bears were number three. And the Bears traded away a bunch of high draft picks. I think they traded away, I think, maybe 2 first-round draft picks, 2 second rounds. I mean, they kind of wiped out draft picks to move up. Um, the Bears wiped out a bunch of draft picks to get Khalil Mack, and the Bears wiped out the rest of their draft picks where they would get high-level players to move up one position so that they would draft Mitch Trubisky. But Mitch Trubisky and Deshaun Watson were both available. So, first of all, you move up that slot and you don't draft the um, you know, multiple national championship winning, proven clutch superstar player Deshaun Watson. You move up that spot to draft a guy who played a year of college and people were still questioning whether that he was really going to be all that good. And the Bears could have just not moved up a spot, let the team ahead of them do whatever, and then say, okay, well, one of those quarterbacks came off, so we'll get the other one. Because at the time, it seemed like both of them were about the same bet, which I don't understand, but a lot of analysts were saying Trubisky, Watson were both about the same bet. And yet the Bears gave away a ton of draft picks to get the guy who now is very questionable whether he's going to turn out okay or whether he's going to set the Bears back for years. And I really can't stand around the NFL's takes on this because they keep bringing up Mahomes. Well, I'm sorry. No one thought about Mahomes in that draft except the Chiefs. And good for them. But we're doing revisionist history if we're going to say the Bears should have gotten Mahomes. The Bears should have gotten Deshaun Watson, and they shouldn't have moved around their picks, but the Bears shouldn't have gotten Mahomes. But, like I said, it is a very enjoyable podcast, even if I disagree with how they treat the Bears. But they came out with an announcement this week that I wanted to bring up because I mentioned one of their hosts is Chris Wessling. And a couple years ago, he told the podcast and then lived out a very public battle with cancer while he was trying to host the podcast. Eventually, physically couldn't handle the rigors of hosting a podcast. And he announced this week that several weeks ago, just before the birth of his first child, he found out his cancer came back. And I think this is a sign of how amazing this podcast is, because these are people reporting on sports. I don't know them. I'm never gonna. They're in Los Angeles. I'm never going out to Los Angeles. Probably. I'm almost certainly never gonna have a way to interact with any of these guys. But hearing that was just so deflating because they pour so much of themselves into it. He said that all of his doctors are saying a couple months he'll be back in remission. They caught it really early. Treatment should be fine. But I think this is a sign of what makes an excellent podcast, an excellent program like this. When you can care so much about the person who's talking, who you don't know and you're probably never going to meet, but when you make such a connection with them personally that when they share some of their personal struggles with you, it hits deep, even when it's a sports podcast and their personal life doesn't have to come into it at all, and yet they do such a great job of tying their personalities and their personal life into it that you're moved on their behalf. I think that is the mark of an excellent podcast. So definitely praying for Chris Wessling and all of the podcasts. They're a huge family, and it's been very hard for them. Go check out their video announcement of this. Maybe let them know, hey, start treating the Bears with some respect, guys. I'm sure I will, but yeah, have some fun. I always find sports fun. So God bless you guys. Have a good week.